Good morning. My name is Lisa Weaver, and I serve as a member of the Executive Committee of the Hymn Society, and greetings to all of those who are joining us online. We also want to acknowledge that we are grateful for the generosity of our sponsor for this plenary, Deborah Carlton Loftus, in memory of Mary Orr. It is my pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker, my dear friend and colleague for this morning, Dr. James Abbington. Here at Candler School of Theology, he serves as the Associate Professor of Church Music and Worship. He is also the Executive Editor of the African American Church Music Series published by GIA. We invite you to visit our conference website for a fuller biography on Dr. Abbington. His address today is entitled The Adopted, Adapted, and Integrated Hymnody of Isaac Watts in the Black Church. Join me in welcoming Dr. James Abbington.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Weaver, for that introduction. And also I want to say thank you to the Executive Committee of the Hymn Society for extending this prestigious invitation to give this plenary address. Howard Thurman succinctly summarizes my gratitude. There are many seasoned men and women who were also inspiring teachers, touching us at a place in ourselves beyond all thoughts and all our virtues. They placed above our heads a crown that for the rest of our lives we would be trying to grow tall enough to wear. This was a gift far greater than the imparting of information and facts. Please allow me to acknowledge a few of those folks who placed that crown above my head. Many of them are here today. Michael Hahn, Paul Westermeyer, Paul Richardson, Carl Daw, Mel Bringle, my former colleague Don Salyers, John Wiffleet, the late James Cone, and my teacher Wendell P. Whalen. And I saved my dear brother and friend who could not be here today, Bob Battistini. Speaking of Carl Daw, Carl emailed me last week and pointed out a fact that is so important. I called it divine providence, that on this actual day, July the 17th, 1674, in Southampton, Hampshire, England, Isaac Watts was born, the very day on which this lecture is being given. I did not know that. So how divinely providential that was. I quickly want to let you know that I have reconsidered and retitled my address, as you can see. Although I enjoyed the sight and sound of alliteration, the adopted, adapted, and assimilated, the word assimilated carries immense social baggage, especially within the context of our racial dynamics in the United States. In sociology, the concept of assimilation refers to the process through which individuals or groups adopt the cultural norms, values, and practices of a dominant or larger society. It involves the integration of newcomers into the social fabric of a society, resulting in a sense of belonging and identification with the larger community. This was not my intention. So therefore, the title is The Adopted, Adapted, and Integrated Hymnody of Isaac Watts in the Black Church. Remembering my dear colleague, Dr. Kalia Williams, on yesterday, as she lectured, I want to begin my lecture by saying, I now invite you to breathe. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And I suppose I should add, it is traditionalism that gives tradition such a bad name. That quote was from Yaroslav Pelikan in his 1983 Jefferson Lectures in the Humanities. From Gustav Mahler, these words: tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. In her article entitled The Use and Performance of Hymnody, Spirituals, and Gospel in the Black Church, Dr. Portia Molesby wrote in the Papers of the Hymn Society, published in 1983, these words: since the 17th century, enslaved Africans in America have participated in two culturally distinct religious traditions. The first tradition represents that associated with white Protestant denominations. The second was independently developed by blacks, utilizing the concepts and practices retained from their West African heritage. These two traditions are easily distinguished by ideology, worship style, and music practices. The musical repertoire of the black congregations that adhere to white Protestant doctrines is derived from official hymnals, which include psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Conversely, the repertoire of churches whose religious ideology is uniquely black consists of black folk spirituals and gospels. Songs of these two idioms are derived from several sources: West African musical traditions, black secular idioms, original black compositions, and white Protestant psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. While the dominant musical forms found in the majority of autonomous black churches mostly include contemporary gospel, praise and worship, and a very few, if any, spirituals, white Protestant hymns, especially those of Watts, Wesley, and Fanny Crosby, continue to be mainstays of the repertoire in many traditional black churches. These rich musical treasures and theological miniatures have been adopted, adapted, and integrated in the immensely diverse music and worship traditions in the black church. While many churches have completely abandoned and moved past the great hymn text of Watts and Wesley, unfortunately, they have not been replaced with an adequate or sufficient equivalent for these biblically based, theologically astute, and culturally relevant gems. The hymns possess a lyrical theology that for the black church has become their musical expression as a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm, and a wheel in the middle of a wheel. The texts and tunes still subsist as anchors of faith, shelters from the stormy blast, a sure defense, expressions of praise and thanksgiving to the one who has brought us thus far on the way. As the seasoned saints of the church now rest from their labors, unfortunately, many of them have taken these songs with them to their graves. The oral transmission of this repertoire has declined over the years, and now it is difficult to keep them alive and vibrant in most churches. This address will examine how the hymnody of Isaac Watts, or Dr. Watts, as he is often referred to in the Black church, and the rich tradition of congregational song was adapted, and integrated into the music and worship of the Black church. Furthermore, this address will examine the hymnody by analyzing the unique details of Isaac Watts' compositional traits, theology, and practices. I intend to show how these musical characteristics have been adopted or approved, accepted, endorsed, sanctioned, chosen, adapted or enhanced, varied, hammered out, shaped, improvised, and integrated or blended, woven into, merged, mingled, included, and infused in the music and worship of the Black church. The first section, adopted. A brief history of hymnody for Black Christianity. Historically, conversion to Christianity required a familiarity with the musical repertoire sung during religious services. Therefore, psalms and hymn singing was adopted and included in the religious instructions given to Blacks. The English practice of lining out the texts and tunes was used to teach these songs to Blacks. With the knowledge of psalms and hymns, enslaved Blacks were able to become active participants in a variety of religious activities at church and in the home of their enslavers. Accordingly, the singing of psalms and or hymns was included early in the inclusively Black religious assemblies. In one instance, a group of enslaved living in Boston in 1693 agreed to always sing a psalm between two prayers during their worship service. By the end of the 18th century, many Blacks were widely respected for their knowledge of psalms and hymn singing, and some could be found even serving in singing schools as masters for all white participants in the northern colonies. Whether attending white churches or conducting their own service, Blacks were expected to sing songs from the established repertoire of Protestant hymnody, according to the prescribed musical norms. For this reason, Northern Black folks were initially unable to develop a distinct body of religious music prior to the founding of independent Black churches. The following account is invaluable in understanding why the spiritual was gradually replaced by hymns in the Black churches. Eileen Southern gives the account of that era as follows. During the 1730s, a new religious movement swept the New England and Middle colonies, the so-called Great Awakening, bringing with it a demand for the use of livelier music in the worship service. The new songs of the movement were hymns. For the text, they employed religious poems instead of scriptural psalms. In 1770, Dr. Watts, an English minister, published a book, Hymns and Spiritual Songs, which became immensely popular in the colonies, especially among the Black folks. Because of their freshness and vitality of the words, they they were accepted, they were adopted. In 1770, he published another collection of his attractive hymns entitled The Psalms of David, imitated in the language of the New Testament and applied to the Christian state and worship. Before long, people began to neglect the Psalms, preferring singing hymns instead, especially since the latter were fitted for livelier tunes. Slowly, the various Protestant denominations in the colonies, one after the other, adopted the hymns of Watts. The era of Watts in the history of American religious music had begun. My teacher, the late Wendell Phillips Whalum, said, "The Black Methodists and Baptists endorsed Watts' hymns, but the Baptists blackened them." They virtually threw the meter signature and rhythm, throughout the meter signature and rhythm, and before 1875 had begun a new system altogether, which, given the original hymns that were based on the style of singing coming from England to America in the 18th century, the new version was drastically different. It was congregational singing, much like the spiritual had been, in which primarily the text was retained. The melody would be in parallel intervals, fourths and fifths, sometimes thirds and sixths at cadence points. And they took a rather crudely shaped line which floated melismatically along, being held together primarily by the deacon, who raised and lined it. It was the kind of singing that white minister Charles A. Raymond wrote about in Harper's New Monthly magazine in 1863. In his account entitled "The Religious Life of the Negro," he observes the following about a service of worship. In the churches of the cotton-growing states, the Negro deacon is no unimportant personage. He is a pastor without being a preacher, and is also the connecting official link between the colored brethren in the church and their white associates. What the white pastor can never know concerning moral and social characteristics of the colored flock, the Negro deacon can know. Nothing was more suggestive than a meeting for the election of a deacon. In the meetings where business is to be transacted, the pastor is necessarily present. He calls upon the singers for a hymn, and the meeting is regularly organized. The usual devotional exercises, prayer, and singing occupy about a half an hour. These are generally conducted by the Negroes, the pastor being a quiet participator in the worship. What the gentleman does not make clear, but is nevertheless included in the practice, is that the devotional exercise which he described are conducted by the deacons. One only need to visit some black churches today that are a bit more historic and traditional than those on the beaten path and in major urban cities to discover the method outlined herein. Dr. Whalum expounds upon this method by stating, "In the service after the devotions, hymns are sung faithfully to the score. In lining, the deacon gives out 2 lines of the hymns at a time and then leads the congregation in singing. Though the congregation is used to the method and the text, they enjoy and follow this practice as it has been done in the past. When the deacons motion for the congregation to stand, it is understood that the current stanza will be the concluding one. Most of the hymns sung in this manner are the hymns of Dr. Watts. A substantial number of Baptist churches have Dr. Watts choirs as a regular part of their musical offerings in divine worship. Akin to Whalem's insight, an oft-neglected resource in American music scholarship is lining out the word. Dr. Watts' hymn singing in the Music of Black Americans by scholar William T. Dargan. This text is unique in that it is the first to take a close look at the important and rarely studied component of African American music, one that has its roots in Europe but was adapted by African American congregations and went on to have profound influence on music of all kinds, from gospel to soul to jazz. Dargan's research illumines a unique American musical genre in a rich, textured narrative that stretches from Isaac Watts to Aretha Franklin and Ornetta Coleman. I have a video clip from a wonderful project by Stephen Sweeney called Together as One Hymn Choir, recorded in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And they are singing a Watts hymn, Go Preach My Gospel. Incidentally, I had planned to use this version this evening at the hymn festival at my church at Friendship Baptist, but unfortunately, there were no folks left alive that knew how to do it. And we couldn't bust the folk from South Carolina down here to do it. It's interesting that these traditions have died out, and so I think the closest was some coastal folks down in Georgia, but this will be the video clip that unfortunately we cannot experience live tonight. Technicians, go preach my gospel. All right, thank you so much. You can perhaps find that clip online by looking up "Go Preach My Gospel, Saith the Lord" by the Hymn Together as One choir, and the clip is about 11 minutes. I wish we had time to see how the more they get into it, the acceleration and the hand clapping, but time is not my friend. The adapted Watts Hymnody in the Black religious formation. Lining out the word, as I said, begins to talk more about the tradition that we just looked at, and he gives some compelling new perspectives on the emergence of the African American music in the United States. And I commend that neglected source to you again, Lining Out the Word by Dr. William T. Dargan. When enslaved Africans adopted the practices to their own uses or blended with other music, such as work songs, something new was developed. On the whole, Isaac Watts' hymns have been more successful in the Black church than the hymns of Charles Wesley. Using the chronology of the AME hymnals from 1892, 1941, 1954, and 1984 as a barometer, while the 1892 hymnal has, out of 461 hymns, 46 by Watts. The 1984 hymnal retains 36 out of the 670 in that collection. The imagery of Watts' hymns has always found a peculiar favor with the Black worshiper. There were the principal hymns sung in the aforementioned lined tradition through the antebellum and postbellum eras. So much so that the lined singing continued to be commonly known as the Dr. Watts style, even if the hymn was not written by Isaac Watts. Some of these that are commonly misappropriated, attributed to Watts, are "A Charge to Keep I Have." I think you know who wrote that. "I heard the voice of Jesus say, guide me, O thou great Jehovah. Father, I stretch my hand to thee." During the golden age of gospel, ensembles like the Clare Award Singers performed the gospel hymns in a gospel idiom alongside the gospel songs of Lucy Campbell, Thomas Dorsey, J.H. Brewster, and Kenneth Morris. I call it gospelizing the hymn. The inclusion of Watts' hymnody is in these more popular musical settings speaks to their long-standing power among Black Christians in the United States. Compared to the hymns of Wesley and other evangelicals, Watts more often seems to have a peculiar significance for contemporary Black worshipers, but like the former, they also tend to have an eschatological or heavenward view, which is generally pronounced in the closing stanza. Often commencing with a social theme, Watts' hymns almost predictably take a Calvinistic excursion towards heaven, most like the climaxes of the Black folk preacher. Consistently, the Old Testament theology of God as liberator of the oppressed is severely dampened by the centrality of praise for the sovereign Lord. The first hymnal compiled expressly for the use of a Black congregation was published in 1801. Titled "A Collection of Spiritual Songs and Hymns Selected from Various Authors," it was printed for Richard Allen, who is identified on the title pages as African minister. Richard Allen is justly celebrated as the founder of the world's first black Christian denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME, which he served as its first bishop. He is also recognized for his civil rights activities in Philadelphia, but little attention has been given to his pioneering role in laying the foundation for Black American hymnody. The first edition of Allen's hymnal contains 54 hymns. The second adds 10 more hymns, making a total of 64. Some of the hymns were most certainly written by Allen himself, judging from the familiarity to hymns he published in other places. Others that bear all the earmark of folk hymns may have been penned by Allen's church associates. Like many other hymnals at that time, Allen's hymnal belongs in the genre of the pocket hymnal, measuring slightly larger than 3 by 5 inches in size. Like other hymnals of the time, Allen's collection contained only text without author attributions or references to melodies that would be appropriate for use in singing the hymns. Later editions of the AME hymnal would include such references. Eileen Southern traced 26 hymns to authors by locating concordances in the 18th century sources. There are 13 in the table of contents taken from Allen that are Watts' texts. Am I a soldier of the cross? Awake my heart, arise my tongue. Come, let us lift our voices high. Cursed be the man forever cursed. Earth has detained me prisoner long. Early, my God, without delay. How long shall death the tyrant reign? Lord, what a wretched land is this. My thoughts are awful subjects roll. My thoughts on awful subjects roll. Oh, if my soul were formed for woe. There is a land of pure delight when I can read my title clear. And why should we start and fear to die? While we may assume that Allen's congregation used the same tunes as did other congregations singing his well-known hymn, such as those written by Isaac Watts and Charles Wesley, it seems obvious that in some instances the congregation of Bethel AME in Philadelphia, often called the Bethelites, must have composed their own melodies and adapted popular street tunes for their purposes. Another reason for the historical importance of Allen's hymnal is that it seems to have been the earliest one to include hymns in such wandering refrains and choruses are attached. That is, refrains freely used in any hymn rather than affixed permanently to specific hymns. You will hear one of those tonight in the hymn festival. Thus, Allen's hymnal became a primary source of the worship song, which later were called camp meeting hymns, an early progenitor of the 19th century gospel hymns. While the first decade of the century is notably its publication of camp meeting hymn collections, none are dated earlier than 1803, 2 years after Allen's hymnal is published. Whether or not Black Methodists should be credited with inventing this form, as some contemporary sources imply, Allen's work certainly must be credited for being the first to publish any examples of the form. I want to draw specific attention to the fact that the term spiritual song in the title of Allen's collection does not have the meaning at the time that it would have later have applied to those of the folk-composed Negro spiritual. Fine distinctions cannot be easily drawn between the hymn and the spiritual song in this period. Hymn compilers commonly use such titles as Allen's used as far back as 1651 with the addition of the Bay Psalm Book entitled The Psalms, Hymns, and Spiritual Songs of the Old and New Testament. And Isaac Watts used the term in his landmark publication of 1707, Hymns and Spiritual Songs, which was given an American edition in 1739. The three terms point back to the scripture in Colossians 3:16, wherein Christians are instructed to teach and admonish one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. While initially drawing upon similar scriptures and texts, the earliest spiritual songs of Black American hymnody featured signature identifiers in terms of both form and content. In the second edition of Sing with Understanding, Harry Askew and Hugh McElrath offer a summary of the characteristics of Watts' hymns, noting that his hymns left their mark on the form and content of the English hymn for decades. They write, in terms of form, it is simple. In meter, only common, long, and short was used. Vocabulary, predominantly Anglo-Saxon words, with preference for monosyllables. It is striking in its opening line, tersely proclaiming the theme of the entire hymn like a headline. It is frequently in use of repetition and parallelism, following the structural principle of the Psalms. It is often half-rhymed with liberal use of imperfect rhymes or mere assonance. It is dramatic in its climax, usually expressed in a final stanza. In terms of its content, it is comprehensive in scope and cosmic background. It is Calvinistic in theology, emphasis on doctrine dealing with the glory and sovereignty of God, the depravity of human nature, the security of the elect, and the all-sufficient atonement of Jesus Christ on the cross with the sins of humankind. It is Christian in focus, Christ exalted and adorned above all else as the very center of worship. It is liturgical in purpose, inspired by the setting of public worship and conceived for the use of people in the congregation in public worship. It is scriptural in flavor, faithfully paraphrasing scriptures and masterfully incorporating biblical language, allusion, and thought. There is an analysis that I think is very helpful in this idea of his form and his content, presented in discussion of how Watts liked to model his hymns with preaching and singing, this was a very distinct interplay between the word preached and the word sung. Singing what is preached and preaching what is sung. William Reynolds and Milburn Price comment on this blend in worship by noting, Watts was called the father of English hymnody not because he vastly improved or reformed the hymns that were already being written in his day, nor because of any radical change in form or structure. It is because he produced a new song based on the experiences, thought, feeling, and aspirations common to all Christians, expressed in what might be called classic objectivity. He wrote hymns that would illustrate, reinforce, and climax the pulpit. Sermon and hymn emerged together. but the hymn remains long after the sermon has been forgotten. Sorry, preachers. The sermon, or more accurately, the preaching, is the focal point of worship in the black church, and all other activities find their place in some subsidiary relationship. In most black churches, music, or more precisely singing, is second only to preaching as the magnet of attraction and primary vehicle of spiritual transport for the worshiping congregation. In some of the more traditional churches, even the sermon and often the prayers of the ministers or deacon are sung in a kind of ritualistic cadence peculiar to the black church. The unique nature of the black church is perhaps most significantly analyzed by W.E. Du Bois, who once said, 3 things characterize this religion of the slave: the preacher, the music, and the frenzy. About the music, he says, the music of Negro religion is that plaintive, rhythmic melody with touching minor cadences which, despite character and defilement, still remain the most original and beautiful expressions of human life and longing yet born on American soil. Sprung from the African forest, where its counterpart can still be heard, it was adapted, changed, and intensified by the tragic soul life of the slave until, under the stress of law and whip, it became the one true expression of a people's sorrow, despair, and hope. It was the great service of Du Bois in his unforgettable chapter on the sorrow song in the souls of black folks, which he gave music a serious and proper social interpretation. Other scholars later began to analyze and interpret the music today, giving it dignity. The humble origin of these sorrow songs is too indelibly stamped upon them to be ignored and overlooked. But underneath broken words, childish imagery, and peasant simplicity lies, as Du Bois pointed out, an epic intensity and a tragic profundity of emotional experience, for which the only historical analogy is the spiritual experience of the Jews, and the only analog, the Psalms. Given the form, context, and scriptural resonance, it stands to reason that hymns of Isaac Watts would find their way in the canon of the black church. Those psalm-based hymns include one such as "I love the Lord, he heard my cry," from Psalm 116, "O God, our help in ages past," Psalm 90, and "Jesus shall reign," Psalm 72. The most popular among them include "Am I a soldier of the cross?" "Alas, and did my Savior bleed," or "At the cross," later, "Come we that love the Lord," or "We're marching to Zion," after the 19th century refrain. "From all that dwell below the sky, I sing the mighty power of God, Jesus shall reign, joy to the world. When I survey the wondrous cross, go preach my gospel, saith the Lord. When I can read my title clear, and come Holy Spirit, heavenly dove." All of which, not all of which, you will hear this evening at the Hymn Festival. One of Isaac Watts' most remarkable hymns, but lesser known, that I was privileged to hear sung by a hymn choir, or a Dr. Watts choir, in a small black church in South Carolina many years ago, was "Go Worship at Emmanuel's Feet." Has anybody heard that hymn? Go Worship at Emmanuel's Feet. Well, I'll tell you probably why you haven't. It employs 14 images of Christ that convey the adoration and praise Emmanuel. Go worship at Emmanuel's feet. See in his face what wonders meet. Earth is too narrow to express his worth, his glory, or his grace. He goes on to say, is he compared to wine or blood and bread? Is he a tree? Is he a rose? Is he a vine? Is he a head? Is he a fountain? Is he a fire? Is he a rock? Is he a way? Is he a door? Is he designed the cornerstone for men to build their heaven upon? Is he a temple? Is he a star? Is he a sun? Now that's actually an oratorio, that's not a hymn. The rich musical legacy of Watts has been explored in the decades since, particularly in his contributions to theology. In 1962, John W. Work III of Fisk University published a 6-movement choral cycle entitled Isaac Watts Contemplates the Cross, and I've borrowed that title for this evening, published by Broadman Press in Nashville. This particular work was the director of music at Fisk and served as director of the Jubilee Singers from 1947 to 1956. This choral cycle includes the text of Watts, but that have been set to music by Work. When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, Alas, and Did My Savior Bleed? Alas, on that dark and doleful night, how condescending and how kind. Now a tune of lofty praise, and Hosanna to the Prince of Light. Finally, integrated, the continued legacy of Watts' hymnody. Taken in the historical perspective, Watts was the single most important influence in giving the church an effective congregational song. He was not the creator or originator of the congregational hymn or hymn singing, and it is only in a restricted sense that he can be called the father of English hymnody. He owed a great debt to others, but far exceeded them. During his time singing in congregational worship had sunk to an all-time low. Sounds familiar. Watts wrote, and I quote, "While we sing the praises of God in his church, we are employed in that part which of all others is most akin to heaven. And it is a pity that they should be performed the worst upon earth. To see the dull indifference, the neglect of thoughtlessness air that sits upon the faces of a whole assembly while the psalm is on their lips, might even tempt a charitable observer to suspect the fervor of inward religion." He saw the need for change in congregational singing and used every means and power to enhance, enrich, and enliven it. I want to move on to something that I found fascinating in my studies of Wesley over the past year. I'm sorry, Wesley Watts. Jesus, Watts. Guess that'll be next year. I don't know when that thing is coming up. But in a wonderful book that I read, The Poetic Wonder of Isaac Watts by Douglas Bond, I found some words that I had not discovered in all the other reading that I did. Watts understood that our passions are intensely directed toward material things, but hardly moved by the more important discoveries of faith. He was warning against the stale, lifeless singing in worship in his youth, and he rightfully wanted to see emotion and passion, as we do, in sung worship. He knew that passions are glorious and noble instruments of the spiritual life when under good conduct. But here is where Watts is a countervoice to many well-meaning worship leaders today. He knew that passions are ungovernable and mischievous energies when they go astray. He grasped, as so many must, that in the business of church leaders, it is the business of the church leader to both assist the devout emotions and to a guard against the abuse of them. Bond continues to emphasize Watt's warning that light comes before heat. Watts warned church leaders, let him not begin with their emotions. He must not artfully manipulate their passions and feelings until he has first set their doctrines before the eyes of their understanding and reasoning facilities. The emotions are neither the guides to truth nor the judges of it. He argues that since light comes before heat, Christians are best prepared for the useful and pious exercise of their emotions in the spiritual life who have laid the foundation in an ordered knowledge of the things of God. He goes on and he refers to the fact that we must sing God's praise with the Spirit, but with our mind also. In conclusion, one simple fact is sure. When Isaac Watts was born, scarcely a hymn was sung in church. When he died 74 years later, having written over 600 hymns, the floodgates of church praise had been flung wide. And Watts' hymns have been adapted, and integrated in the worship of the Black church ever since. They have been an essential musical reservoir for the Black church and continue to provide the text and tunes for the church to express its hope, faith, and spirituality. When Watts' hymns retain their meanings and their text as survival tools, providing through his text the will to persevere amid cruel and inhuman conditions. Even preachers often use the poetics of Watts' hymnody to express what mere words cannot say. They know that the best way to move a congregation to embrace the message as a word fittingly spoke to them is through some well-worn, beloved hymn. Cleo LaRue comments, it is as if the congregation is saying in its audible response to the hymn, yes, preacher, this song helps me drink from the fountain of the familiar. Our testimonies are wrapped up in the words of that hymn. We have been this way before, and we know exactly where you are going. Certainly, Isaac Watts' faith and stewardship of the hymns and their texts have been deep wells for the Black church, helping us to sing the Lord's song in a strange land. Thank you. Thank you.
We are grateful for Dr. Abbington's address and how it sets us up for this evening. It is 10:27, and so we are scheduled to have a break at 10:30. I invite people who want to take their break and go to silent auction to please do so, but we will engage in a brief time of questions. So for 2 minutes, turn to your neighbor and chat with each other about ideas you've heard in this plenary and come up with an excellent peer-reviewed question. The clock is ticking.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wow, I tell you, like I said, I guess Wesley will be my next project. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, it was great learning a lot about Watts, things I did not know. Yeah, yeah. When I had to just start turning pages, it was so much stuff. I tell you. Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thank you, thank you. Oh, Lord. Well, I need to talk because I need to talk with someone because I need to, well, I'll talk to Courtney and I need to make a contribution. And so this will enable me to do so. Thank you, thank you. Mhm. Okay, thank you. Okay, okay, thank you.
Oh, is the mic on? I need a mic. Very good. I trust your questions, at least the conversations, have been robust. We don't know if the questions are going to be robust, but we pray. We press on in hope. Do any of our current Lovelace scholars have a question to ask Dr. Abbington? Hearing none. Do any of our fellows have a question? Oh, wait, there's a question in the back? Okay. Do any of our fellows have a question? Floor is open. Who has a question? All right, there's a question in the back and then one here. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Jim.
Oops. I'll get there. Can you turn the sound on? Can our sound engineer?
I'll get there. Thank you, Jimmy. And thank you for all the help you've given me in my own studies over the years. I really, really appreciate it. What I want to know now is, and you can tell me this later, biographical information on William T. Dargan. Do you have any of that?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. Let me first say that William T. Dargan is a Morehouse man. You know, in case you didn't know that was my alma mater. But he is a retired professor. I can't remember the institution that he taught in South Carolina. Yes, he is still alive, and I actually had hoped that he had been able to be here today. I think he completed his PhD at the university, it may be of UCLA, in ethnomusicology. So his book was actually a reworking of that dissertation. It is available online if you've got a research account to purchase. Yeah, I had to purchase my copy from Amazon. Yeah, so yeah, but thank you. It's one, I think it's California University Press. Need I say more? Yeah, okay, thank you so much, Dave.
And there's a question here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your address. I have a, excuse me, a theological, if you could reflect on, I'm curious why the Black church would have favored the Calvinistic doctrine versus the grace-filled theology of Charles Wesley. And I'm a Methodist, so I'll give that disclaimer of my own personal bias.
Yeah. I don't think it was an either or. I don't think that they said, oh, we're definitely Calvinists, we're not Wesley. They were as diverse in their theology as they were in their music. That was so clearly demonstrated last night in the hymn festival. And I so appreciate you, Dr. Ford, for that. Because if you could see in all of that hymnody, particular of C.P. Jones, it is sprinkled with Wesleyan theology. In that holiness grows out of the Wesleyan, the revival, holiness movement. I mean, I don't think it's an either or. It's just interesting that those hymns get into the hymn book. And I think that's one of the things that you have to be so careful when you grab a hymn and say, oh, they sing this. No, the hymnal committee figured we should put it in there. Yeah. Anybody relate to that?
Carl has a question.
You've been on a hymn committee, but don't tell anybody I said so. Yeah.
Carl Daw has a question.
Carl! Thank you for Carl for letting me know today is Isaac Watts' birthday. Thank you.
Other Carl.
Yes, this is from online. can you develop a connection between Watts' hymns and the Great Awakening?
Well, I think that, I think Eileen Southern said it pretty much, that during the hymns, the attempt to sing a new song, a new type of singing, was developed during the Great Awakening. It was moving more toward this camp meeting hymn, which blacks found very relevant. They liked the livelier tunes. They liked the text. So I think Dr. Southern is right on target, that the Great Awakening became this wonderful period. You know, we don't talk about the Wesleyan, what is the holiness, I mean, the development of the holiness period. You look at those dates, 17, Lester Roof's wonderful book, A Little Heaven Came Down. You know, blacks and whites were actually worshiping together and shouting together and falling out and farking at the mouth, bucking and sizzling and frying, you know, and we write that out of history, you know, but it was very much an inclusive type of singing of both blacks and whites. And so there again, blacks adopted it, they adapted it, and they integrated it into their worship. And certainly, I think the Great Awakening was certainly a pivotal point because of what it basically gave to hymnody in America. Thank you for that question online.
And yet there's a question over, there's two questions over here.
Your line about when Watts was born, there was very little hymn singing. By the time he died, everybody's doing it. I couldn't help but think of this: adopted, adapted, and integrated hymnody into the English church.
That's right.
In the same way is repeated then in the African American church. Am I pushing that too far?
No, no, no. I think it was. Watts was very, very unhappy in his youth with the singing in the church. And he said, something's got to be done about this. You know, we have, you know, I've got to do something because people should, that quote, you know, I love, you know, he says that, you know, people sit there and they look, you know, they're just stone-faced, they're just lifeless. And so he wanted a hymnody that was going to be more meaningful. Some people say, oh, it's just more emotional. But yes, he did that. And he composed his own as well. This is one of the things I think about C.P. Jones. That's why if you look at that hymnal, his fullness songs, some 400 of those were written by C.P. Jones. Why? Because he was trying to write for a doctrine and for his people. He was not trying to, you know, win the, you know, the hymn competition. He wrote the songs. He said God gave him the hymns for his people. And I think that's very much what I read into Wesley. I think you're right on target with that.
Martin, you had a question? Yes, Martin has a question.
Martin!
Thank you, Dr. Abbington, for this address.
Jimmy, doctor's not on my driver's license.
Thank you. The recording from Rock Hill, is that right?
Yes.
I'm wondering if that might be somewhat insightful as well for us understanding what white psalm singing could have been at one time too, because it's always referred to negatively, this very slow singing, this drawling, this filling in with unauthorized notes by people who wanted to change it in a singing school way. If you take away the negative part of that and put it positively, it seems to define very much what that singing is like. And if that might be a window to us understanding what our own heritage is as well.
Now see, there you go. Okay. You know, I'm a professor, you know, so I mean, there is a video, I think it's about 30-some minutes, I show it in all my classes. It's called, and you must write this down, a conjoining of ancient song. It's by my good friend Willie Ruff. It was a project that he did at Yale some years ago. Those of you who are quick at it, do you know that project? Yeah, it's on Vimeo. Vimeo, that's right. Oh, everybody in the world needs to see that. It is the most exciting thing because what Willie has done is brought folk from Scotland and how they sang psalms. It's on Vimeo. He brought some folk from the Primitive Baptist Church, I think in Kentucky. He brought a congregation from Alabama who who line leaders, and who sang hymns. Then they show where a Indian tribe in Muskogees in Oklahoma were watching it, and they said, that's what we do. So eventually they're all invited to Yale for this big conjoining of ancient song.
It's only 31 minutes.
It's 31 minutes. Oh, it's worth your 31 minutes. It will bring tears to your eyes. It is, every class I teach, that deals with music in the African American church, I show this video. But it really says, I remember my good brother and friend, John Bell, sent me a recording of Gaelic psalm singing. And he says, listen to this. He says, this is what was going on over here. And then over there, he says, by God, we may be brothers. But just to listen to that psalm singing in the Gaelic tradition, it sounded exactly like what these folk are doing. But that conjoining of ancient psalms says it all. But you were there. Oh, I tell you that I just wish that I had been there for that. That was the most amazing. And you have to watch. And the Vimeo clip just really catches all the emotion of all the people in it. Now, let me also say, there is a brother, I reached out to him who did this picture up in Rock Hill, who did this video. His name is Stephen Sweeney. When I reached out to Stephen, I was brokenhearted to know that he was suffering had two strokes. Young brother, but really just had this love for preservation of singing. And he had gotten these choirs together. In fact, Darden and I were talking about the fact that where do you go to find this? And we were talking about in South Carolina, I'd like to just get a grant and spend about a semester and a half, eight months in various regions of South Carolina, where some of this music is still alive and everybody hadn't died. But every day that the cemetery gets a new body, so does that history go into the ground, and we don't have it. So there's still some people in the Rock Hill area, I think they call it the Piedmont area, South Carolina. I don't know if anybody's from South Carolina. But they still have seemingly a desire to structure and keep and preserve that history. I think Stephen has about 4 CDs that are out there, and I encourage you to look for those. But that one comes from a DVD called Together as One Hymn Choir, but just some absolutely fine recordings. Like that one, Go Preach My Gospel, actually is about 11.9 minutes. In fact, that cost me some of my lecture because I played it too long. Yeah.
Are there any questions over here?
Okay.
It is 10:42, colleagues. We will convene in our next sessions at 11 o'clock, so we're giving you time for a break. Join me again in expressing our gratitude to Jimmy.
Thank you so much. Thank you.